Okay. Good morning, everyone. It is so wonderful to see so many faces here, and I know we have lots more online. It's great to see so many familiar faces, but also to see so many people I don't know, which is testament to the power and the reach of this wonderful, wonderful update. My name's Helen Sullivan. I have the great privilege of being the Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific, the only college of its kind in the world, and one that is treasured by this institution. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands and airwaves we meet, and pay my respect to elders past and present. As many of you will know, we meet on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I would like to extend my particular acknowledgement to them for the continuing work that they do on country and to support us here in this fantastic institution. It's a great pleasure for me to be at the Indonesian Update Conference again this year, particularly special because we're celebrating 40 years, can you believe this, of Indonesian Update history. I think that deserves a round of applause. As many of you will know, the first update was convened in 1983 on the initiative of the late Dr. Peter Macaulay, who sadly isn't with us today, and his is a loss that we feel tremendously in our community, and I know his loss is felt much beyond the ANU. But since then, the annual event has become the biggest conference on Indonesia outside of Indonesia, and every time colleagues talk to me about the power of this institution in terms of its expertise and reach. Those kinds of facts are so compelling to me, that what we are able to do here through the extraordinary efforts of our wonderful academics and professional staff is to have this really, really critical resource that is incredibly engaged with Indonesia, Indonesian scholars and policymakers, but sits outside of Indonesia. This year's conference is convened by my estimable colleague, Professor Ed Aspinall, who's here to my right, and Dr. Amelanda Savirani, who I think is, no? Where is she? What are you doing over there? Goodness me, give her a round of applause. Because I bet you any money, it'll be her that's done all the work. Am I wrong? Her and Catherine, of course. So this update is fabulous because it explores something that's very dear to my heart, urbanisation. I'm a political scientist and have worked most of my life in urban studies, and so the trend of urbanisation that's been long unfolding in Indonesia is fascinating, both in its own terms, but also for what it tells us, those of us who are interested in urbanisation more globally. As more people live in urban areas, new problems arise, such as waste management, traffic management, and of course, the ever-present challenges of climate change. And of course, on top of those physical challenges, urbanisation brings changes to the social, economic and political landscape, which all need to be understood and managed carefully. So this conference is going to examine all of those developments, both from a historical context, but also considering that conjunction, if you like, of demography, economy, environment, politics and social perspectives. As always, the conference begins with updates, looking at the political and economic developments in Indonesia over the past 12 months. And that's always a great scene setter for the conversations that happen afterwards. None of this would be possible, as I've indicated, without the fantastic support of colleagues within the institution, but also the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade provide and have provided ongoing support to us for such a long time, and it's really important to thank and acknowledge CFAT for that ongoing contribution, without which many of the things that we do wouldn't be possible. But that's more than enough for me. My one remaining very happy task is to introduce the Indonesian ambassador, who is no stranger to this campus and is somebody I've just said we really ought to find an office, because he's here so often that I feel we ought to be treating him perhaps better than we do. But His Excellency Dr. Siswo Pramono is somebody who is well known to all of you, and it's my pleasure now to hand over to him to deliver the opening address. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Allow me to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the custodian of the land, and pay respect to the elder past, present, and emerging. My task today is to provide opening remarks. It's easy for the timely themes of our update today, governing urban Indonesia. So I would like to qualify my remark as a personal opinion. I need to be very careful with that. And this is an academic forum. Don't consider me a naughty. I know many TFET here, so I'm not a naughty ambassador. Please believe me. The data that I present is qualified as a work in progress, so don't quote it because it might not be completed with the proper references. Yeah. So and how to move this? Here. No, it's not working. Next slide, please. So last week, Indonesia has successfully concluded its chairmanship in ASEAN. It was during the Indonesia chairmanship that Prime Minister Albanese announced Australia's Southeast Asia strategy to 2040. According to the Prime Minister, Southeast Asia's fast-growing economy presents a major opportunity for Australia. Australia's economic future lies with Southeast Asia. The next slide, please. Now, it's a bit complicated and a lot of colors. Australia and Southeast Asia relation can be depicted in this spatial slide. This slide depicts the GMT, no, previous one, Mike. Slide GMT time zones. Perth and London are separated by 8 hours difference. I mentioned Perth because Perth is the largest delegation coming in the ASEAN Summit. But Perth and Beijing are located in one time zone. Perth is also located in the same time zone with Manila, Hanoi, and Seoul. Between Perth and Jakarta is only 1 hour difference, so this is the case also between Perth and Singapore, Hong Kong, and Tokyo. So you can imagine yourself, you have breakfast here in Canberra, call your business partner in London. This guy will be pissed off because it will be in the middle of the night. But if you call your business partner in Jakarta, it will be happy conversation because they are having breakfast too. The only difference that you eat Vegemite and bread, and for them is perhaps Indomie and telur rebus. So the urban economies that you see in the map are the motors of economic growth for East Asia. All these urban economies are well connected digitally and are very close to Australia. Last week, the leaders of the East Asia Summit have agreed on a strategic document on maintaining and promoting the region of Southeast Asia as an epicentrum of growth. So as we notice from the illustration, I draw a red line from Perth all the way to Beijing. This is just an example of the strong economic ties between Australia, Western Australia, and China. This is particularly true for the business of critical minerals, including rare earth. Western Australia is the center of the production of lithium, rare earth material, as the world is now moving toward energy transition, and then the electric vehicle, everything is on the talks, and the demand of lithium is rising. And Australia supplies half of the demand on the global lithium. 70% of the lithium is processing in China. So this is also the case with the rare earth material. Rare earth are used for the permanent magnet, and all the high-tech production and products need the rare earth. But China also the main processor of the rare earth. So if you see in the map, the Australia embarked on the China +1 strategy, which means business diversification China remains very important for Australia, but there is a need for the de-risk of the investment. Business calculation demands more security for the global value chain. So there's a lot of discussion now that India and Indonesia both are very fast-growing economies, demographic bonuses, and also democracy will be chosen by Australia as the new destination of investment. I think this is one of the nature of the new strategy. But if you look at the next slide, if you look at this slide, you can see that 65% of Australian total trade is with Asia. And within this Asian market, the largest Australian total trade is actually with China and with ASEAN. And voila, I think this is the opportunity for ASEAN. So, but on the other side, you see the Lowy Institute thermometers, as depicted in the slide. That measure the Australia public perception about particular state. The warmer the temperature, red, means that the closer the feeling of the Australian public to the particular country. Ironically, if you look at the Australian main partner like China, Indonesia, and India, statistically they are very important for trade with Australia. They are among those who are not perceived warm enough by Australian public. So the task of the forum, I believe, you need to help Indonesia getting warmer in Australia. Push up a little bit. So embrace us with your warmer hands, not the cold one. So improving an understanding about Indonesia is very complex task. For instance, our Indonesian update today on governing urban Indonesia also touch upon the issue of democracy. And democracy is very important because it gives a lot of public more channel on the decision making and also on the governance. So measuring democracy in Indonesia, for instance, cannot escape the dynamic of democracy at the global level. The next slide, please. So you cannot just see Indonesia as it is, but you need to contact with the global level as well. Now, as depicted by the slide, there is a regression of democracy at the global levels. If we compare the democracy index by Economic Intelligence Unit from 26 in the left to 2022, and you will find some finding, but sometimes it's a bit scary. So, for instance, the number of authoritarian regime, according to the Economic Intelligence Unit methodology, increases from 55 to 59 countries. Hybrid regime, according to this Economic Intelligence Unit methodology, increased from 30 to 36. And the so-called full democracy decreased from 28 to 24 countries. Now, the next slide. There are many reasons for this global regression, but due to the constraint of times, I cannot discuss it here. But this is also very interesting. So amid the global regression, my last slide showed the dynamic of Indonesia's democracy, which tend to improve in the last 3 years. So Indonesia is in the yellow line. Is it yellow line? It's Indonesia. In the detail, Indonesia experienced the improvement of democracy in year 2012, which the Economic Intelligence Unit attribute as the rise of commoners, Wong Chile. By then, Jokowi and Ahok were elected as the governor and vice governor of Jakarta. Then, the next, Indonesia experienced the regression of democracy due to the rise of identity politics in 2017. And then the world plunged into COVID pandemic. See the red line. It is during the pandemic that, again, democracy in Indonesia experienced some improvement. According to the Economic Intelligence Unit, this improvement were attributed to the functioning of government in the handling of COVID-19 and the increasing political participation. My point is that measuring democracy is not simple, but should not be simplified. This is all the complexity that the Indonesian update is expected to be able to transmit effectively the development in Indonesia into Australian publics. If the future of Australia is as underlined by Prime Ministers lies in Southeast Asia, then improvement of Australian public knowledge about Indonesia and Southeast Asia will be very vital for the implementation of the strategy itself. To this end, I highly appreciate the convening of this update. So I wish you all the best, enjoy the discussion, and thank you very much. Exactly 10 minutes, yeah?
Thank you very much, Pat Siswo and Professor Sullivan. And now let me hand over to the chair of the first session, Dr. Sana Jaffrey.
morning. I would like to begin my remarks by acknowledging the first Australians on whose lands we live and work, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I would like to thank Helen for her continued support to Indonesia studies at the ANU, and to Pa Siswo for his continual engagement with the community of scholars here. We are really grateful for your encouragement and support. And it is my pleasure today to introduce the speakers for this session. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Jacqui Baker, who is an eminent scholar of Indonesian politics and is currently serving as a lecturer at the lecturer of Southeast Asian politics at Murdoch University, and is a fellow at the Indo-Pacific Research Center. Dr. Baker will deliver the political update today, and she will speak for about 40 minutes. And we have as our discussant today Dr. Gammon. Dr. Gammon is a fellow at the East Asian Bureau of Economic Research and is more known to us as the editor of New Mandala. Dr. Gammon will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we will have a session for questions and answers, depending on how much time we have left. Dr. Baker, it's your floor.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge our chair, Dr. Sandra Jaffrey, and my discussant, Dr. Gammon, and I'd like to thank the update coordinators, Professor Edward Aspinall and Associate Professor Amalinda Savirani, Linda, for the generous invitation to speak today. In 2014, when Jokowi took up the reins of government, many amongst us, including myself, saw this as a renewal of reformasi. He spoke about democracy and human rights and rule of law and anti-corruption, all from a president produced through the political structures of decentralised democracy. Today, in that twilight of that presidency, with all the achievements that the president has made, I think that reformasi is dead as a salient political force. And Indonesia's democracy, whilst it still endures, is definitively post-reformasi. In other words, there's no longer an organised and politically salient national coalition able to push for the core goals of reformasi. Reformasi is no longer a compelling framework that shapes the national political discourse. And in fact, as we'll see, the principles of democracy and human rights and rule of law and regional autonomy and anti-corruption that are so actively and routinely undermined that the way we talk about Indonesian democracy needs to move beyond reformasi. Do I have the clicker? Yeah. Okay, so this is the structure of my talk. And so we see this evidently in the year that has passed, a year marked by ongoing election uncertainty, the criminalisation of political actors by the very institutions that once championed judicial activism and the war against corruption. And this has led to a narrowing field for political contestation in Indonesia. These are the antithesis of the goals of reformasi. So over the next 40 minutes, I'm going to discuss how these dynamics are dramatically reshaping the field of party coalition making towards a presidential nomination as Indonesia gears up for the 2024 elections. I'm going to then turn to some of the other big events of the year, specifically the Kanjuruhan Stadium tragedy and the inability of oppositional movements to respond to human rights abuses on a massive scale. Then I'm going to turn to the push for re-centralisation through new institutions coming out of the Ministry of Home Affairs. And finally, I'm going to turn to the question of why, and why is this happening and why now? And it's not a space for a full explication of that argument, but I want to make what I call a structural intervention into the debate about quote-unquote democratic regression, drawing attention to the massive socioeconomic changes that capitalist development has brought Indonesia. Millions have been drawn out of poverty, an achievement that the government and all of us rightly celebrates. But as Indonesia enters upper middle class status, we need to turn our attention to the question of lifted to what? Some have become middle class and enjoy economic stability, but most, in fact 44% of Indonesia's population, have fallen into a vast and disparate category that the World Bank calls the aspiring middle class. Another way to describe this group of people is Hal Hill's term, which is the precariously non-poor. And I'm going to argue that the political narrowing that we see is part of a set of dynamics set in train by the government's inability to meet this aspiring middle class's needs within the specific political economy of Indonesian development. So in my paper, my argument is that the dynamics of this political narrowing, or democratic regression, is about demobilising this class, harnessing them to the state's developmentalist project, and managing away their unmet aspirations. So I'm going to turn first to an overview of the Indonesian elections. Okay, so on the 14th of February, Valentine's Day, for those who love democracy like I do, 200 million voters, most of them under 40, will go to the polls to elect their president and the national and regional legislatures. This is one of the largest simultaneous elections in the world. It is a logistical feat, and Indonesia has done this before. Now, of course, there are some issues with running a massive simultaneous election. It's a system that's quite confusing. There's a high chance of spoiled ballots. Obviously, regional elections get kind of muffled out by the presidential contest. And it's much harder to pick up election tampering and fraud. But what you need to know about this process is that to have the right to nominate for president, parties need to have 24% of the total votes from the previous election distribution. Nobody has this 24%, so parties need to form coalitions. Where are we? And that process has absorbed much of the political energy in Jakarta this year. So what's the political landscape shaping up to look like? Well, we're looking like we've got 3 coalitions. You guys, what was that? I thought this was a very neutral slide. I'm puzzled by the response. Okay, so what is this political landscape shaping up to look like? Well, we've got 3 coalitions nominating presidential candidates. Anies Baswedan came out as the first horse running last year, and he's presenting himself as the opposition, as the antithesis of Jokowi, reflected in his name, the Coalition for Change. And in this Coalition for Change sat 3 parties, 2 actual opposition parties, the Partai Demokrat and the Party for Prosperous Justice, and the National Democrats, run by a media baron by the name of Surya Paloh. This has been a particularly febrile kind of coalition, and I'll show you why in a minute. But most recently, the Democrats, the party of our former president, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, have left the coalition after his son had a big tanty because he was passed over for the vice presidential position in favour of Muhaimin Iskandar, or Caimin, and the ambitious head of the National Awakening Party. So we've seen that opposition coalition get some reorganising. With the entrance of the PKB, the loss of the PD, PKS is a little wobbly. If PKS leaves, the Coalition for Change probably won't be able to affect much change because it won't have the votes to meet the presidential threshold. So it's a real watch this space. Nonetheless, this is the only presidential pair that's been consolidated. So let's turn to the Onward Indonesia coalition. Prabowo, the head of the Great Indonesia Movement Party, or Gerindra, be familiar to you. He's running for his 3rd shot at the prize. But it's a very different Prabowo, guys. He's very smiley these days. He's a happy guy, okay? All right, he spent most of the year in coalition with the PKB. But once Golkar entered, and the Moon and Crescent Party and the National Mandate Party, Caimin thought, well, I'm not going to get much of a voice in here, and he has gone off to Anies. In the middle is PDIP. And Megawati finally nominated Ganjar Pranowo, governor of Central Java, after polls were pretty spectacular. So she had to give up the dream, I guess, of Puan's nomination, and she's gone for Ganjar. This is a thin coalition, which reflects PDIP's 19% contribution to that nomination, and the United Development Party gets them quite close. PD is considering this coalition, but there's got PDIP, Party Democrat, two rival dynasties, kind of awaiting a peace treaty between Megawati and Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, which might get orchestrated through their little nepo children, Puan and Agus. Okay, so the latest in the polls, done with high sophistication. As you can see at the moment, the real contest is between Ganjar Pranowo and Prabowo. These polls came out a couple of days ago, and they're for a surveying period for August. You can see, though, that the top two, Ganjar and Prabowo, their numbers fall actually within the margin of error. So it could really go either way. There's sort of pluses and minuses on either side for each candidate. On one side, you've got Ganjar, who's a regional level politician. He doesn't have the name recognition yet of Prabowo, and he hasn't really started campaigning proper. And so he's probably got room to grow in his polls. On the negative side for Ganjar, he really seems to lose percentage points when Megawati kind of makes a display of power over him. So can she keep it together through the campaign period? Prabowo is a national figure, and he's got a lot more campaign opportunities to campaign and to campaign alongside Jokowi than Ganjar has. On a head-to-head, it appears that Prabowo has got the lead. But, Prabowo's a bit old and he's a bit tired and he's 71 and, can he really pull those young voters when you've got that cute little impish Ganjar face, right? For Anis, he's been on the decline all year after a kind of a strong showing last year. And I guess one of the problems is when you present yourself as opposition, you get a real bounce when people are sick of government. But when you have approval ratings like Jokowi's, well, then Anis doesn't have much to sell, right? And this brings me to my next slide, which is that the president has emerged as a real kingmaker in this 2024 election. Jokowi's approval rates are somewhere between 80 to 85%, which gives him serious weight in the contest. His endorsement appears to send sort of 10 to 20% of voters to the candidate, and with that endorsement boost, he can set himself up as kingmaker over this process of nomination. And so we're seeing Ganjar and Prabowo compete for the attentions of Jokowi, and they're doing this in a number of ways. So, there's a lot of lavish praise for Jokowi at events. Prabowo renamed his coalition the Onward Indonesia coalition after the name of the cabinet, or Team Jokowi is what he calls it informally, and PDIP gets really annoyed about that. But the second important thing is that the candidates and the discussion around policy is really shaped by furthering Jokowi's legacy, right? In particular, his legacy project, Nusantara, the new capital in Kalimantan. Why is this so? Well, the capital is not the capital is kind of got 50-50 public support. There's unclear financing. We're in a bit of a global economic downturn. Without political will, this mega signature project from Jokowi will fall by the wayside. So Jokowi has made it his business to extract promises for his signature project from all the candidates. And even Anis, our opposition party, promising change, is very reluctant to counter the presidential policy agenda. Finally, we see the two main candidates, Ganjar and Prabowo, desperately courting the president's son, Gibran Rakabuming Raka, as the vice presidential candidate, which will shore up the family dynasty and give Jokowi an ongoing presence in politics, which is always good to do, especially if you've been doing a lot of infrastructure projects. And Jokowi is keenly aware of how the SBY government ended, which was sort of in a morass of corruption scandals, and the tarnished legacy that left that family. So putting forward his son Gibran is a really good way to protect the legacy and the family. Nonetheless, Gibran has pretty slim political experience as Mayor of Solo. He's under 40, so he's currently ineligible to be nominated. We'll come back to that. He's not polling great. I don't think he's a really great media. Not great in the media. And he looks like one of my undergraduate students who's about to ask me for an extension. So So I don't get it. Like, would you seriously trust the faith of the world's fourth biggest country to a guy who's just learned to tie his Balenciaga sneakers? So the field is still wide open, right, for the other president. It's got some Gibran supporters over there. All right. Did I just break this? Can you pass to the next one? Okay, so the field is still wide open for other vice presidential candidates, and we see them here. There'll be some familiar faces to you. Ganjar is kind of courting Ridwan Kamil, the former governor of West Java. There's a bit of a problem with that because Ridwan Kamil is joined Golkar, who's part of the Prabowo coalition, so not sure what's going to happen there. Sandiaga Uno, who said he's not going to run with Prabowo again. He's kind of, this is kind of a red flag, isn't it? And so he's sort of in the Ganjar lineup. Prabowo is also courting Yeni Wahid of the Wahid dynasty and Eric Thohir, current Minister for State-Owned Enterprises, head of the national football body PSSI, and sort of Jokowi's kind of can-do clean-up guy. He's also part of the Astra family, so he brings a lot of capital to the bid. There's been quite a lot of discussion also about a possible pairing of Prabowo Ganjar. I think that is definitively out, but that was a big discussion this year about a potential pairing of the two, which would be an incredible stitch-up. To me, despite all the intrigue, I think the kind of law of Indonesian elections is you've got to win in at least 2 provinces of Java. It's hard to beat Ganjar and the PDIP machine in central Java. This leaves West and East Java at play, right? Our 2 biggest electorates. Gerindra has a pretty good party machine in West Java, Anies to a lesser extent. The game seems to be about East Java, our 2nd biggest province. You can win the presidency without West Java, but no one wins it without East Java. And this makes the NU vote, always a very diverse group, the key voting bloc to capture. And we already can see that, right, with Anies trying to capture that, trying to sort of draw in those NU votes from East Java with the nomination of Caimin from PKB, which is an NU-aligned party. So there's some real questions. Will PKB and Caimin be able to consolidate the NU vote below him? Will they bring those votes to an Anies ticket, especially after the last sort of tensions between Anies, traditional Islam, and quote-unquote Islamist supporters? Will East Java continue to dominate how presidential hopefuls strategise for the vice presidency? What about the money? That's always an issue with vice presidencies. This will all become clear over the next months. Okay, so that's our primer on the election. And I want to turn now to the dynamics that are narrowing the field of democratic contestation in Indonesia. And there's 5 dynamics together, and as I argued, they run directly counter to the core vision of Reformasi, which to me signals that we are now in a post-Reformasi era. The first one is that there has been quite a lot of electoral uncertainty, and last year's update talked about an effort to justify a 3rd term for the president. Those efforts seem to dissipate this year, and instead we saw circulating a fear of an election delay, some kind of orchestration of a delay to the election, which would extend by default the presidential term. And those fears really became politically plausible with a bombshell finding in March in favour of a small, unknown party called Partai Prima, who took the National Election Commission, the KPU, to a lower-level criminal court in Jakarta. And their argument was that they had been unfairly ruled ineligible to participate in the election. The decision that came down agreed with them and said that the government needed to delay the election to July 2025. This decision really came out of nowhere, right? And it was in the wrong court. It was in the criminal court. It should be in an administrative court. And it elicited such outrage that the decision was overturned, and the justices who ruled in favour of Partai Prima were punished. And then I think their punishment was retracted, weirdly, but anyway. But between 3rd termism and election delay, there feels like there's some testing of the water around the regularity and the certainty of democratic elections. My next point turns to criminalisation, and the field of democratic political contestation has been seriously compromised by the efforts of these two men. On the left, we have, is that your left? Yes. Okay, left. We have Attorney General Esti Burhanuddin, whose family is linked to PDIP. On the right, we have the head of the KPK, Firly Bahuri, who has turned a real beacon of Reformasi, the Anti-Corruption Commission, into, frankly, a very effective political weapon. And they've launched a series of corruption investigations which have been designed mainly to weaken the Anis coalition, our coalition for change, but also used against government allies whose affiliations they would like to sort of realign through the nudge of a threatened corruption case. So I'm going to dig into this a little more. In November 2022, after the Coalition for Change declared their intention to field Anies Baswedan, the KPK arrested Lucas Anembe, governor of Papua, and a major fundraiser for the Parti Democrat on charges of bribery and money laundering. The KPK have also put Yassin Limpo, the NASDEM agricultural minister, also under investigation, NASDEM being part of the Coalition for Change. After the announcement of Cak Imin as Baswedan's vice presidential candidate, he received a summons to the KPK to discuss a graft case while he was manpower minister under a previous administration. Firly has also repeatedly pursued Anies Baswedan, allegedly for corruption in the electric car Formula One event in Jakarta organised under his governorship, known as the Formula E case. But he's yet to make a move, and some argue, like his own director of investigations, he doesn't have the evidence to make these charges stick. Others argue that an actual outright arrest of Anies might be counterproductive and galvanise support for his campaign. So by keeping this Formula E case hanging around, it really muddies the waters. It's made it very difficult for the Coalition for Change to get volunteers, to mobilise support, and to get momentum in his campaign. It's also made that coalition, as we saw, much more unstable. And the polling numbers, as we saw, suggest that pursuing Anies without charging him has been quite effective. We've also seen the rise of the Attorney General's office as a tool of criminalisation. Previously, it didn't instigate corruption cases very often. That was very much the KPK's turf. And now I think we're seeing it as a bit of a preferred provider of criminalisation services to the political elite. The big fish at court this year in May was Johnny G. Plate, the NASDEM Minister for Communications and Information. And NASDEM, again, part of our Coalition for Change. And he was caught on a US $800 million 4G telephony procurement scandal. This served a major blow to NASDEM, particularly to Surya Paloh himself, who is kind of individually being punished for betraying the Jokowi coalition. And it's deprived the party of much-needed funds at a time in which it needs to spend to raise the profile of Anies. More recently, we saw the head of Golkar, Airlangga Hartarto, dragged in for 12 hours of questioning to the Attorney Generals, ostensibly about, another old kind of palm oil case. And this was really interesting because Golkar seems to be wanting to form a fourth coalition around for a presidential nomination, obviously with possibly with Airlangga as the head. But pretty soon after that interrogation, we saw that fourth coalition integrate into the Prabowo onward ticket. So this map of party coalitions I showed you is not a map of shared ideology or a common policy platform or even kind of trusted alliances. It's a map that has been generated by the coercive stick of criminalisation, harnessed to the political interests of the palace. And these coalitions have been forced under the weight of corruption charges, of being cut off from key party fundraising, cash cows, or bled dry financially. And so I think we can anticipate the map is likely to change further. What about the role of the police, which is always my area of interest? Whoops. This year, the police has been kind of embroiled in scandal and they've been keeping it quiet. They sort of continue with the day-to-day grind of processing defamation and fake news criminal charges that seem to be placed routinely against regime critics and activists and journalists. But the police are really still positioning themselves politically. They're quite confused by Jokowi's mixed signals. Is it Ganjar, is it Prabowo? And they're a bit discombobulated by the possibility of a Prabowo presidency and what that might mean for their privileges. And I raise the police because I think it's a very much watch this space. In 2019, the police played a very important role in the Get Out the Vote for the Jokowi campaign. And I think it'd be very interesting to see where they go in 2024, particularly under these candidates. Like the KPK, we've also seen the Constitutional Court, a product of Reformasi, go from a space of judicial activism to being the preferred arena in which political elites go to contest and consolidate power. And that's been made possible with the ousting of Justice Aswanto, because he was kind of an uncertain quantity for the government. But it doesn't mean that the court's outcomes are determined. The court is quite factionalised between PDIP and a faction under the president's brother, Anwar Usman, who heads the court, and some kind of non-aligned justices. And what that means is that the court's decisions are not captured by a single political group, and the outcomes of those decisions are the product of splits in the political elite. So before, when this was a space of judicial activism, when there was contestation between civil society and government, there would be a serious run for civil society. I don't think we're seeing that anymore, right? It's a pretty much sure bet that they're going to fall with the government. But when there is contestation between parties, the outcomes are less certain. And we saw this year when PDIP put forward the case for a closed party list system, and this was rejected by the court. And the closed party list means that the voters can only vote for the party, and the party will then determine the candidate. And it sort of really takes the power away from voters to choose their preferred candidate. And all the other parties rejected this proposal on the grounds that it would reduce the quality of Indonesia's democracy, which it certainly would. The court found in favour of the other, rejected PDIP's proposal. But the court is currently listening to, is hearing a case from PSI, which is kind of a minor tribute party to Jokowi, and they're taking the case for lifting the presidential age limits to this court in order to allow, it's seen in service of Gibran, Jokowi's son, who's angling for that VP ticket, but is blocked by the age stipulations. So what about protest and civil society movements? There, okay. How can this play out with so little pushback? And late last term, I think the last term of the Jokowi administration has seen real, sincere attempts by the student movement and other civil society actors to reinvigorate the politics of the street, right? And that's been covered by previous updates. The KPK law in 2019, the job creation law, the Reformasi di Korupsi movement. We're seeing a new generation of students trying to invigorate the political salience of the Reformasi movement, but they're sort of spluttering and dying. Why? Well, they're met with a lot of coercion from Polri, a lot of kind of counter-ops from intelligence and other specialised Polri groups. But more importantly, I think they are very isolated, and that reflects decades of very effective harassment and criminalisation at the grassroots, stamping out other kinds of community-based peasant and rural movements who, had they flourished, they would be just the kind of mobilisation partners who would join an alliance with a student movement, right? And forge a national cross-class coalition for change, which was the basis of Reformasi, okay? So this absence I want to draw your attention to, especially when we talk about the Kanjuruhan tragedy. In October last year, a match in Malang on home turf turned into a mass grave when police responded to unruly elements in the crowd with tear gas. Gas swept into that overcrowded stadium and people struggled to get out. 135 people died, 38 of them were children, and the youngest was 3. Asphyxiated by tear gas, filling the narrow exits and stairwells. And this was the second biggest death toll at a soccer match in world history. The last one was like in the 1960s, and it made international headlines. Reports from Komnas HAM agreed it wasn't the crush that killed people, it was the use of the gas, okay? So we had a really fully live-streamed mass killing of children and families by a pretty brutal and incompetent police who never should have been deployed in that stadium. If there was ever a moment for social movements to come together, this was it, right? Why did this government stand? The enormous mobilisations we saw in Malang around this really failed to seed a national protest movement. And why? And there's a lot of reasons, but the palace and the police are really locked in an alliance of mutual benefit, and they kicked into damage mode. For Jokowi, as president, he's personally responsible for the police. In another context, you would have expected a ministerial resignation, right? But calls for accountability never landed at Jokowi's feet. Instead, he toured the stadium and he called it a problem of doors and stairs, and he promised infrastructure for football stadiums. Meanwhile, kind of clean-up guy, Eric Thorir, was dispatched immediately for high-profile meetings with FIFA, including coaxing head of FIFA, Gianni Infantino, to visit Jakarta and sort of reassure the country that Indonesia would not be sanctioned for this event. We saw other oversight organisations, like the National Commission for the Police, chaired by Mahfud MD, move to defend the institution and muddy the waters about the police responding to football hooligans. And finally, we saw silence from some elements of civil society, particularly those embedded with the police in order to bring about reform, right? Last year, Ken Setiawan talked about the elimination of sexual violence law, and that implementing that law means setting up a new directorate within the police for the elimination of sexual violence. This is a fantastic outcome, but what does it mean when we have NGOs working on policy? It means it's really, really difficult for them to comment critically when these kinds of events happen. And that really has fragmented national, social and protest movements to bring about change. The big mobilisations in Malang were subject to harassment. There were harassment of victim families, the hacking of phones, there was a scaring of witnesses, hacking of reporters' phones, like the new digital platform New Narrative. And these strategies worked to localise and isolate that emerging movement for revolution, as you see in the banner there, revolution for Malang. In the meantime, Polri really doubled down on another scandal which had been unfolding all year. And that scandal, some of you might be familiar with it, it was pretty shocking actually, it involved the execution of the junior officer Joshua Huta Barat by a fellow junior officer, Richard Eliza, ordered by the head of police oversight, Inspector General Ferdi Sambo, and apparently his wife. And so to contain Kanjuruhan, the police utilised their vast media and social media infrastructure to amplify and shape the media coverage of Ferdi Sambo. And it seems sort of counterintuitive, but in doing so, they really drowned out Kanjuruhan. They transformed this murder and its subsequent trial into a bit of a soap opera, right? We were all sort of scrolling and following it, right? Feeding people every day a real dramatic story of an angelic victim, Richard Eliza, his repentant, and Ferdi Sambo, the kind of general sent mad by rage, right? The coverage was massive. And by amplifying the arrest and prosecution of one bad police egg, it effectively preserve the structural police impunity for the 135 dead in Kanjuruhan. I think given his role in Kanjuruhan, the president's much awaited acknowledgement of past rights abuses by the state felt a little absurd. And I think what was interesting was that the coordinating Minister for Politics, Law and Security, Mahfud MD, reminded activists over and over after this statement came out that through this statement, Jokowi was making good on his original promise to resolve past human rights abuses. And it was the ambition of that promise back in 2014 that effectively galvanised a much more vibrant then civil society behind the Jokowi nomination to carry forward the mantle of reformasi. So it's hard not to see that this apology was a bit of a mealy-mouthed concession to a civil society who have been betrayed and made complicit in a regime whose respect for human rights is so minimal that 135 people can die in public and nobody is really prosecuted. And this turns to my final point, now I want to turn to my final point, which is around the re-centralising dynamics we're seeing out of Jakarta. In Papua, we saw again the government making good on an election promise to resolve the conflict in Papua through the provision of special autonomy. Part of that special autonomy has been the creation of 3 new provinces, Central, South, and I don't know how to translate this, Pergunungan, like this mountainous province. It's great, I love it, which promises that the state and all its resources will become closer to the people through greater democratic representation. But as we've seen elsewhere, I think the creation of new provinces has often produced quite a compliant political leadership that frequently get involved in the mismanagement of funds. In the meantime, as special autonomy is being rolled out, we're seeing the acceleration of natural resource extraction in Papua through the creation and expansion of food estates and mining, where the core beneficiaries are not in Papua but in Jakarta. So the failure of special autonomy to answer the core question about the redistribution of resources for Papua is really seeing the emergence of a new generation of quite militant fighters, of young fighters in the Free Papua movement that has intensified fighting in the province, particularly in the new provinces. But of course, these divide and rule tactics of Pemekaran has a long history in the sort of tense centre-periphery relations of Reformasi. But what I want to draw your attention to this year is the implementation of new institutions of decentralised governance that work quite actively and directly to displace the democratic principles of regional autonomy. And I'm going to cite my colleague Ian Wilson over there, who has done great work on this. So regional leaders, like the simultaneous election, the regional leaders will also have their day of simultaneous election, in which they're all elected somewhere around October and November 2024. But as the terms of the regional leaders finish up, the question becomes who leads in the interim. And that question has been answered unilaterally by Home Affairs, who is in the process of appointing over 270 individuals as placeholders, who take the role of interim regional lead heads to govern in the transition while we wait for an election, right? But this is including appointing core regime insiders and a host of intelligence, police and military officers to regional leadership positions, sometimes for up to 2 years. And there they have the access to the full resources of the regional government without any of the democratic legitimacy. It's unclear what is their mandate to govern and how will they govern. A good example here is Heri Budi Hartono, Jokowi ally, who was part of the Ahok administration. He's taken over the helm of the Jakarta governorship and recommenced elements of the Ahok agenda, which was rejected at the polls, right? Adding to these dynamics of recentralisation, the administration has also extended the terms of village heads from 6 to 9 years on the argument that village elections create too much contestation, they're too disruptive. And it's worth remembering that village heads already don't have to come from that village to represent the village, right? So these are institutional innovations coming out of the Home Affairs Ministry, who is run by close Jokowi ally and former police chief Tito Karnavian. He himself seems to be a real anti-regional autonomy ideologue. He talks about asymmetrical democracy, where sort of regional democracy is reserved for the provinces that have a specific rank on the Human Development Index. And while I don't think his views are shared widely, we are seeing a kind of, the political parties seem to be much closer to his position than they have been before. So there's a sort of turning to an anti kind of regional autonomy position out of Jakarta. And that's really being fed by the position of multilateral institutions, that regions are fiscally inefficient and they're messy and they're not delivering, and Jakarta needs to take back more fiscal control. So we're seeing the consolidation of a range of ideologies that ultimately lead to an anti-regional autonomy position. So the final minutes, why is this happening? And previous speakers to the update have had different ideas. Oh, thanks. Have had different ideas, and I'm not going to go through them all. But to me, missing in the current debate about democratic regression is the underlying structural changes we've seen in Indonesia. And by that, I mean the way that Indonesia's model of capitalist development has successfully lifted millions out of poverty. But it's important for us as political scientists and social scientists to ask, well, what have people been lifted into? And some have achieved middle class status. Indonesia's middle class has doubled since 2002 to be 20% of the population. Middle class spending, I think, is half of consumptive spending. But the majority have turned into a category that the World Bank calls the aspiring middle class. And they are now 44% of Indonesia's population, a massive demographic, a massive voting bloc, mass of voters. Now, when I say aspiring middle class, you might think of prosperity, right? But another way to think about them is as Hal Hills calls them, the precariously non-poor. They have a job, they have some consumptive income, but they're extremely vulnerable to falling back into vulnerable or poor status. They are your restaurant waitress, your construction day worker, your Gojek driver, your market seller. They tend to be clustered in informal employment, but they also, about a third of them are in low-tier formal employment, so they're vulnerable to restructures. They're also the urban majority. As a result, they're on the brunt end of Indonesia's urbanisation. They live in overcrowded, congested conditions with poor infrastructure, poor air quality, polluted water, and they're very vulnerable to climate change. These are all indicators of non-monetary poverty. They are a vast and disparate socioeconomic group. But what unites them, and this is why I stick with this word, is their aspiration to middle-class status, right? And they can get there if they have access to better government services and more stable, better paid employment. But that aspiration, if unmet, is potentially very dangerous, right? And I think Jokowi thinks that too. So we see him emphasise over and over the provision of services, the increase of quality of education. We've seen him connect people better. We've seen the infrastructure drive. But as Jokowi has found out after 2 terms of government, in Indonesia's political system, change is not easy to deliver, right? And that means that many will not achieve the goal of economic security that the government has promised them. And I think that managing this group politically is critical to maintaining rule, both under Jokowi's regime, but also future. And it's my argument in the paper that democratic regression is part and parcel of trying to manage the unmet needs of this massive socioeconomic demographic. Can I just have 1 minute? Okay. So to conclude, the events I've outlined here speak to an underlying dynamics that are not only shrinking the space of political contestation, they run fully counter to the core principles of reformasi. Election uncertainty, the end of judicial activism, the end of the war on corruption, re-centralisation, the failure of national-based protest and social movements tells us that the period we have known as reformasi is definitively over. By post-reformasi, I don't mean that the ideals of reformasi are gone, but the social forces that worked in coalition to bring those ideals are no longer politically salient. I also don't mean it's the end of democracy, right? We see the failure of presidential third terms and failure of presidential third termism and the failure of efforts to delay the election. So electoral democracy is still a pact that works in the interests of political and party elites. It's also not likely to be the end of reform. We've seen lots of kinds of reform, neoliberal, nationalist, efficiency, moral reforms. But whatever happens with the coming election and Indonesia's democracy, every regime is going to have to confront the contradictions that capitalist development has produced. And that's not just in Indonesia, that's in Australia too, yeah? And so whatever the case, the growth of this demographically dominant, precariously non-poor, who have bought into this developmentalist dream, who are desperately knocking on the door of middle-class status, and yet the political economy of Indonesian capitalist development is unlikely to deliver the economic security they crave. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Baker, for starting us off with such an insightful overview. And I'd like to invite Dr. Gammon to deliver his comments as the discussant.
Thanks very much, Sana. And thank you, Jacqui. Thank you very much, Pak Siswo. And thanks, of course, to the organisers for inviting me to act as the discussant to Jacqui's paper. It's good to be back in the Coombs Lecture Theatre. It feels like a bit of a homecoming for this conference. This isn't quite the last Indonesia update of the Jokowi era. He'll still have about a month left on the clock at the time of next year's conference. But it is the last update where we'll get to look back on a full year of Indonesian politics. before next year's election set in motion a transition to the next presidential administration. So I've got to keep my hands off this. And at that milestone, I think Jacqui's paper contributes something really valuable by drawing together analysis of the year's events into a compelling diagnosis of the structural contributors to Indonesia's democratic regression. Now, there are a few main messages that I think we can take home from Jacqui's paper. The first one is that reformasi is dead, and it didn't die of natural causes. The Jokowi administration has systematically closed off pathways for social movements to engage in sustained confrontation of the government. Secondly, there's a resulting sense that contestation over policy, though it still occurs, and to an extent, even electoral competition itself, happens on the administration's terms. As Jacqui put it, there's a narrowing space of who can contest power and how. Thirdly, this is all an outgrowth of the government's response to the challenge of maintaining and managing the confidence of an emerging electoral majority of non-poor, but not necessarily economically secure Indonesians, whom Jacqui describes, borrowing from the World Bank, as the aspirational middle class. So the first thing that I'd say about this system that Jacqui's described today is that, judged on its own terms, it's been pretty successful. Jokowi's leaving office, not just with the highest approval ratings of his presidency, but the highest of any departing president of the post-Reformasi era. SBE left office, I believe, with approval ratings in the mid-50s. Jokowi cracked the 80% mark a couple of months ago, and he stayed there since. It's quite remarkable, even on a global scale. So looking beyond 2024, Jokowi leaves a very attractive political template for his successor, not to mention, I think, a policy agenda that's more or less set in place. He's shown that a president can achieve substantial dominance over the political landscape without enacting radical change to the institutional framework that could trigger a backlash from voters and other elites. Instead, a president can kind of salami slice their way to that dominance using the carrots and sticks that existing institutions provide. The innovation that Jokowi and his sort of proxies have brought is nothing more than a determination to use those tools for their own strategic political ends. And it's important to remember that this works for every strategic group in the Indonesian political system, more or less. Everyone's taken care of. Legislators can use their relationships with the executive bodies they oversee to access state resources to fund their patronage needs. The organisational leaders of political parties can deal themselves into the executive by exploiting that gatekeeping role to the presidency that the electoral system gives them. Jacqui's described that quite capably and how the coalitions are shaping up for next year. And once the elite has been brought on board by a president, civil society can safely be ignored or intimidated. The businesses, that is, the ones that actually fund parties and presidential campaigns, are making money from an economy with very strong growth prospects. And in general, the voters are enjoying rising living standards and a slowly but steadily expanding social safety net. Jokowi genuinely has a good story to tell on the economy. We've all got to give him credit for that. So, and forgive me if this is a little bit glib, but we might say that the real crisis of the system is that there isn't a crisis of the system. A key part of Jacqui's analysis is that Indonesia's transition to a post-reformasi politics goes hand in hand with the emergence of that aspirational middle class as Indonesia's at least numerically dominant social group, if not politically dominant. She's sceptical of the ability of the Indonesian government to deliver them the economic security they need, precisely because of the elite's deep investment in a political economy of predation and clientelism. In this account, the economy that Indonesia needs to secure broad-based prosperity requires a different kind of state, underpinned by different kinds of social and political coalitions. Now, Jacqui didn't offer a lot of speculation about exactly how much longer this predicament can be papered over with economic growth or the sublimation of class politics into cultural politics. But I think that's one of the big questions we're left with. How robust is this whole political arrangement to a sustained economic stagnation or a downturn? Does that elite consensus crack up if the voters no longer feel like they're enjoying rising living standards, or a critical mass of them don't. I think there are also alternative scenarios that are worth considering. I mean, what if Indonesia succeeds? What about the potential disruption that's in store for Indonesia if, instead of staying mired in this political economy of the middle income trap, it gets through and much of that aspiring middle class just becomes middle class? Now, for better or worse, modernisation theory is a bit of a punchline in the study of Southeast Asian politics, but without wanting to make any assumptions about whether these middle classes will emerge as a force for democratic renewal in years to come, I think it is a really fruitful agenda for scholars of Indonesia to examine whether and how this aspirational middle class becomes a constituency for the rule of law and a state that can protect their rights and deliver them with public goods much more effectively than it does now. What about the divides that open up within this majority middle class on the basis of education, urban-rural divides, everything, property ownership, religious practice, everything? Age is a big one. And I would say that most immediately, this will become relevant quite quickly, how does the political system maintain the confidence of young Indonesians who are increasingly able to access university education and might have expectations in terms of their lifestyles and economic opportunities that the Indonesian economy can only partially meet? Now, all of these are fascinating questions, but they'll play out quite literally over generational timelines. So whether they do play out within the context of an electoral democracy or some kind of other non-democratic regime could well be determined by the choices that political elites make in the next presidential administration. And so that brings us to what most of you really showed up here to hear about, which is the presidential elections. So Jacqui's laid out that one key feature of this election is that it's proceeding on terms that are very favourable to the interests of the Jokowi government. The two leading candidates, Prabowo and Ganjar, are both overtly affiliated with the president. And even Anies Baswedan, who's so far, I mean, you would call him quasi-opposition at best, not overtly opposition. That image has been softened by the inclusion, has been softened by his surprise alliance with PKB and Muhaimin Iskandar. And there are questions about, whether even that deal has the president's fingerprints on it. So this spread of candidates, Jacqui says, bears the signs of what she says is orchestration by the administration. It's also been marked by some quite worrying interference that really deserves to be underlined. As Jacqui mentioned, there's been an effort afoot to use legal cases, some of which clearly have merit, some of which are a little dubious, to destabilise and intimidate Anies Baswedan's nominating coalition. This has included KPK Chairman Firly trying to get Anies charged with corruption. If Anies were to be convicted, he would be legally ineligible to be nominated for president. I mean, the time frames are very short. The horse is probably bolted, but I think it's important to keep in mind. Because at last year's update, Ken Setiawan highlighted talked about how the resilience of electoral competition, that fundamental competitiveness of the Indonesian political system, still survives despite the illiberalisation of the system. Well, I don't want to be too alarmist about this, but I would just say that if it becomes normalised for the legal system to be abused by incumbents, to handicap their adversaries' political campaigns, or to erect unsurmountable legal or political barriers to their participation in elections, that is exactly the kind of evidence that would suggest that Indonesia is lapsing from illiberal democracy into some kind of competitive authoritarian regime. I want to emphasise Indonesia is not at that point yet, but I think that the signs are there for us to be vigilant about that kind of thing in coming years. So having said all that, even absent any interference from the government, no smart candidate that is, really has an interest in making this election a referendum on Jokowi or Jokowiism. The risk is that you will get on the wrong side of it. And we're dealing with a president with an 80+% approval rating. It's not smart strategy. So is this an election about nothing? Looking at that Indonesia Survey Institute or LSE poll from August, we can get a little bit of a snapshot in time of what's guiding the electorate's choices in the run-up to 2024. Unsurprisingly, a big predictor of how people are going to vote is how they voted in 2019. I'm just going to give you very rough numbers because I don't have slides. I don't want to bewilder you with too many numbers. So, the 2019 Prabowo, I should say that the story of Prabowo's sort of leading edge in the polls is that the 2019 Prabowo vote is going about 55% to Prabowo, about 40% to Anies. Unsurprisingly, only about 5% to Ganjar Pranowo from PDIP. Prabowo's edge is the fact that of that 20-odd% of the total electorate that plans to vote for Anies in a hypothetical first round, if Anies is knocked out in the first round of an election in February, or he doesn't get on the ballot, a big majority of that vote transfers over to Prabowo in the second round. So among 2019 Jokowi voters, a majority of them are going for Ganjar, between 50 and 58%, depending on which poll you look at. Prabowo, despite his refashioning as happy, smiley, friendly Prabowo and the heir to Jokowi, he's only actually winning about a quarter of the 2019 Jokowi vote. So the slate hasn't exactly been wiped clean of some of the voting patterns that we saw in 2019. If he wins, Prabowo is likely to win largely based on the same voter coalition that he had in 2019, plus a bit of the Jokowi vote. Ganjar, if he wins, it'll be with most of the 2019 Jokowi vote. And ironically, insofar as Jokowi is shifting his own support to Prabowo, he's doing that in spite of his own voter base preference for Prabowo. For Ganjar, rather. So, going back to my question, is this an election about nothing? So the biggest argument against that proposition is the fact that Prabowo is on the ballot and that he's arguably the favourite to win it. And so we're back where we were 10 years ago, wondering whether the ascent of Prabowo to the presidency imperils the survival of Indonesian democracy. So one thing that we've heard again and again about Jokowi at these Indonesia updates over the Jokowi years is that he's not an authoritarian ideologue. The damage that he's done to democratic norms has been for basically pragmatic political reasons. He wants to clear the political decks so he has maximum authority over the direction of his policy agenda. Jokowi, it has to do with his character, I think, as well. Jokowi is basically a mostly cautious and conflict-averse politician who is more than ready to be guided by public opinion. So the hope with Prabowo is that now that he's been operating within the system for some years, is that the example of Jokowi has sort of rubbed off on him. That it's shown him that radical institutional change isn't necessary for a president to exercise dominance over the political landscape. On the other hand, it's hard to escape the fact that Prabowo is just a different kind of politician to Jokowi. He's got a history of alluding to the need to reconsider Indonesia's post-reformasi political reforms, including the practice of direct elections. Dating back to his military years, he's got a history of risk-taking and rule-breaking, and personally, I doubt that he would let his strategic decision-making be guided by public opinion and economic performance to the extent that Jokowi's has. So it is, of course, completely plausible that a Prabowo presidency simply looks like a Jokowi presidency, maybe augmented with a little bit more, violence, a little bit more overt repression, a little bit more, it could get worse. The thing about Prabowo is that I would close on is that he definitely lowers the floor in terms of potential political outcomes relative to Anies or Ganjar. And it's very difficult to predict how he could act in a political, security, or economic crisis. So I'll leave you on that happy note. Thanks very much.
An election about nothing. I don't think I've heard a better description of what we are watching in the polls. Thank you, Liam, for that really great round of comments. We now have time, 20 minutes, for questions from the audience. I'll request that in the interest of time, please keep your questions brief, and please keep them questions, not long commentaries, so that everybody has a chance to get in. I'll take 3 questions at a time. So anybody who is please raise your hands. The gentleman in the blue sweater, the lady with the orange sweater, and then Nava in the back. So we'll start with those three, and then we'll go to a session for questions on Zoom as well later. Please identify yourselves, and if your question is directed at a particular speaker, please name them as well.
Yeah, thank you. My name's John Monfries. One thing that has puzzled me a little bit about Prabowo, watching Indonesian television here as I can, he doesn't look very healthy to me. And I wonder, his eyes are puffy and he looks overweight, which is pretty extraordinary for an old soldier. And are there any rumours about his health or his general health fitness for office?
Hi, Jacqui. I'm Gabrielle Legrand. I saw you mention cyber when you had your first slide up about the police tactics. Is that cyber tactics used by police against political activists? If it is, are we seeing any information about whether it's a homegrown cyber capability, or are they getting help from Russia and China? Because I think that might be something we might want to look at. So what did you mean by cyber, pretty please?
Nafa, can you put your hand up? Yeah.
Both? Is it on? Okay. I guess for both presenters, what do you guys think of the political or voting behavior of the aspiring middle class? Who are they most likely going to vote for? Do they have any class or political loyalty? Thanks.
Thank you. Would you guys like to start with Jacqui, would you like to start off?
Hi, is Prabowo healthy? I had a crazy conversation with an intelligence agent who wasn't quite so sure, but I feel weird to talk about gossip. Look, there's always rumours about his health. He had numerous strokes, I believe, before 2014. He's made it through, 2 election campaigns and, head defence ministry. He's still standing. I think the rumours about Prabowo's health have circulated for a very long time, and we haven't seen him stumble, frankly. I don't know. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, Prabowo's health is the subject of constant speculation, and I have no personal insight into what the exact nature of those health problems are, but we know he's got them. Where there's smoke, there's fire. So it's interesting to think about, if he becomes president, you might have these kind of Duterte-like episodes where he just disappears off the face of the earth for a little while, only to reappear with very little transparency about what exactly he was dealing with. You can get away with that when you're not in the public eye as a president, as he has been for most of his political career. But I think that would be one of the weird elements of a Prabowo presidency.
Look, I guess maybe to be on the naysayer, a lot of the discussion about Prabowo's health came in the context of the orchestration of a Ganjar-Prabowo pairing, on the idea that there might be a pact in which Prabowo goes first as president, Ganjar as vice, and then when Prabowo has to step down or passes or whatever, Ganjar will take over. I really didn't see much hope for that kind of pairing. There's a lot of self-interest still built in the system that drives electoral competition. That's a necessary part of democracy. So I didn't pay much attention to those rumours, but yeah, they continue to circulate. The question around the cyber regional teams. So the police have very homegrown capacities in cyber policing. They were transferred around the war on terror by different Western governments, probably including our own. And so they have been trained to police the internet and police the web in order to root out terrorism. But those capacities pretty quickly got turned around to regime critics and opposition figures. And you add to that the ITE law and then things around defamation on social media and the fake news and hoaxes, and you've got a kind of roving police online looking out for potential regime critics and criminalising them. And often the cases actually don't go to trial, but they just have them there and they sit there. And so they sort of terrify the life out of these ordinary people who have made a criticism against Jokowi, for instance. The cyber teams that I was referring to on the slide, so a lot of the cyber capacity is in Jakarta and at Central Police, but that cyber capacity is readying itself for the elections, and they've set it up in, I think, 8 or 9 different regional police stations. So they're sort of gearing up for policing the election debate that will be happening online. Is there Russian or Chinese influence? I'm unsure. I don't know anything about that. But certainly different governments, as I've said earlier, do work with the Indonesian police in order to raise their capacity on certain fronts. And the Chinese police have been quite close to the Indonesian police for some time now. So, make of that of what you will. I mean, that is all part of the transnational policing kind of industry. Yeah. Do you want to comment on that? Cyber policing?
Cyber policing? No.
Really? You don't have an opinion on something like that? I'm sure you would have thought. All right, so the voter behaviour of the aspiring middle class. This is a really tough question, Nava, because the aspiring middle class, I mean, the word class is a misnomer in some ways, right? It's a group. It's a socio-economic group. A class suggests consciousness and suggests the ability to kind of mobilise and organise for similar common interests. What keeps this as a group is the fact that they are demobilised. They are vast and disparate, and they don't see their common interest. The fact that they are all on the hamster wheel trying to get to middle class status, they've been promised middle class status, and they're just sort of not getting there. Now, if someone was to mobilise them, as Pramono, I suspect did, parts of that aspiring middle class were mobilised under the Pramono 2014 and 2019 campaigns under, a logic of inequality, right? Like he was like, these are, all these other enemies of the state are working against you. And if you're aspiring and you've invested in education, you have great hopes for your kids and you're just not getting there, that's very attractive. That's not just attractive in Indonesia, that's attractive here. This is a problem everywhere. I mean, I'm interested in the aspiring middle class because I think it's eating up democracies everywhere. To come to your point, Ambassador, that that these class dynamics are everywhere, and every regime has to manage the people, the have-nots. We have a 30% constituency of renters in this country and a housing crisis. How do you think that's being managed? So in the question, I mean, you had a question about time, like how long can this system, well, it can continue for quite some time, actually. It takes, it's about ideology, it's about managing that class ideologically, that socioeconomic group ideologically, it's about keeping them split and keeping them disparate, it's about keeping them unaware that they don't have these common interests, and it's about the inability of a political system to produce political candidates that might appeal to this class and bring them together. And I think that is a mechanism of politics that is, like I said, eating up democracies everywhere. So the voting behaviour of the aspiring middle class, vast and disparate at this point in time, and probably more demobilised than we saw in previous campaigns.
Yeah, so the way that I would...
quick intervention, Liam, so we can get to
the way I'd respond to that would be looking at the opinion polls. And if you do that, you will see that the composition of each 2024 candidate's voter base in terms of educational cohorts, income cohorts, is broadly very similar. You actually don't see a story there for noticeable class differences if you conceive of class in terms of income and education. There is a bit of a noticeable difference in terms of uneast busway down space. It appears to be a little bit more educated, a little bit more white collar, a little bit more higher income, but that gels with what we know about the social base of conservative modernist Islam. And I would say that in 2014, 2019, there were modest but nonetheless noticeable differences in terms of how income and education affected both the Prabowo and the Jokowi vote, with poorer, more rural voters tending to go to Jokowi, and the same will be with Ganja. Better educated, higher income, urban Bobos tending to go for Prabowo, although the margins really aren't great. Not a huge deal of class polarization.
Okay, so I'm told we have 3 minutes left, so let's take a quick round of questions first from Zoom, from our online listeners.
Okay, we have one question from online friends. This is from Melinda in Makassar. It's a question for both of the speakers. How do you see Jokowi's actions in terms of sudden mega projects, for example, the new capitals projects, IKN projects, and other mega investment projects, like the recent ecotourism investment in Rampang Batam, which sometimes also sparks local fights? Do you think he just wants to leave grid last project's legacy, or is there something else in that project?
We have time for one more question. Does anybody in the audience have another question? Pak Siswo, silakan.
To Mbak Jacqui. In the last couple of years, we have 12 ministers and high-ranking officials from the parties went to jail. So it's a bit absurd if we consider all as politicians, because they are lengkap, Mbak. Ada PDIP, Gerindra, PPP, and others. So I think this is also, we need to see it from the law enforcement on the working. And the last one is just a comment. To describe a democracy in Indonesia as dead, I think it's too much. Perhaps we are all fans of Superman is dead, but this is not dead. Thank you.
You have 2 minutes to respond. Thanks.
I might do. Okay, thank you, Pak Siswo. Democracy isn't dead. You're absolutely right. Democracy is not dead in Indonesia, but it is no longer driven by a pact of social alliances that can bring about the goals of reformasi. So I guess one of the things we do at this conference is try to provoke a scholarship to think about, well, what kind of democracy are we headed into, right? What kind of democracy is this? Because, reformasi still has been a very important part of the way we've thought about democracy all this time. And now I think we are fundamentally post-democracy. But Indonesian democracy is definitely not dead. And to the point about corruption scandals, the review that I did was of the last year, the big corruption scandals. And, I think it's very clear to see the impact that these corruption scandals, all of which I think were legitimate, actually. These were not false allegations by any means, but they did tend to cluster around the opposition. Yeah. I've forgotten the other
question about the new capital.
Oh, sure, I'll give it a go. Sorry, so the question was, what is behind Jokowi's sort of enthusiasm for mega projects in the last period of his presidency? I'm going to be honest, I don't know. I don't know why you would commit tens of billions of dollars of taxpayers' money to this absurd idea of building a new capital city on the east coast of Kalimantan. I don't know. It's an unconscionable waste of money.
Thank you, Liam and Jacqui. This concludes our political update. We are now breaking for morning tea, which I'm told is served right outside. We ask that you please be back in your seats by 10:45. That's when the economic update will begin. So please be back in your seats by 10:45. Thank you.